A rope meant for men. The hangman had tied this not 100 times before. He didn't flinch. He didn't pause. The knot slipped into place like a reflex, practiced, tight, final. The crowd outside the courthouse in Port Royal muttered as the bell tolled. Another pirate, another gallows. No one cried. No one protested. That was how it went for most pirates. Men, brutes, rascals of the sea who chose cannon over conscience. Their fates were sealed the moment they were dragged ashore in chains. But today was different. The figure standing on the scaffold was not some rum-sodden sailor with a musket and a missing eye. It was a woman, red hair wild in the humid wind, eyes defiant, cheeks flushed, not from shame, but from anger. She did not weep. She did not beg. And she certainly did not look repentant. And Bonnie, they whispered. And beside her, Mary read. Two names now infamous, but at that moment, they were curiosities, anomalies in a world built for men. The executioner hesitated for the briefest moment, looking at the sheriff. The sheriff looked at the magistrate. The magistrate looked at the priest. No one wanted to give the order, because the truth was, the legal system in the 18th century had rules for thieves, smugglers, heretics, even witches. But it had no script for female pirates. What do you do when the bloodthirsty marauder wears a corset? When the criminal on trial for murder and mutiny has a womb? The law had not prepared for this, not in its cold Latin pages, not in its powdered wigs, not in its moral comfort. So instead of a rope, and Bonnie offered them a riddle. She pleaded her belly. Pregnant, she claimed, as did Mary, and so the hangman untied his knot. The gallows waited, but the women did not swing. They had, in a strange and defiant way, won the day. But their story was not the only one lost in the sea breeze of time. For every Anne or Mary whose name survived the ink of history, there were dozens, hundreds, of women who sailed, stole, fought, and were forgotten. Women who lived like men and died like myths. Some were hanged. Some escaped. Some vanished behind veils of shame and legend. And some, like Qing Shi, rewrote the entire rulebook. This is not a tale of heroes or villains. It is not a bedtime story about corsairs with hearts of gold or misunderstood mistresses of the deep. It is a story about power. About what happens when a woman refuses to stay in the box history built for her. When she picks up a blade. When she commands a crew. When she sails into the storm. And when she's finally caught, what does the world do with her? Sometimes it hangs her. Sometimes it pardons her. And sometimes it pretends she never existed at all. The sea was no place for a lady. There was an order to the world, or so they claimed. Men worked, women wept. Men sailed, women waited. The ocean was for oaths, battles, storms, and secrets, not for soft hands or high voices. The sea, they insisted, was no place for a lady. And yet, the sea never listened. It didn't ask if you wore breeches or skirts. It didn't care if you prayed or painted. It cared only that you held the line when the waves came, that you stood your ground when the cannon roared. Salt water didn't discriminate, neither did sharks, or bullets. So when the first woman stepped onto a ship not as cargo, not as cook, but as crew, it was not the sea that raised an objection. It was society. There were rules, unspoken and etched in fear. A woman on board was bad luck. She would curse the voyage, sour the wind, invite Poseidon's wrath. She would distract the men, tempt mutiny, destroy discipline. She would bleed and scream and meddle and moan. But what they feared most was not her presence. It was her potential. Because if a woman could sail, fight, and lead like a man, then what else had they been wrong about? So she dressed like a boy. She lowered her voice. She bound her chest and tied her fate to a stolen name. The records don't tell us who did it first. Maybe it was a fisherman's daughter who hid in a barrel. Maybe a tavern maid who stowed away out of revenge. Maybe a widow who had nothing left to lose. What we do know is that once they were out there, on the open water, far from the sermons and sewing needles, they didn't look back. They learned the ropes. They climbed the rigging. They loaded pistols, aimed them, fired them. They memorized the stars and spat into the wind and carved their names into wood. They weren't passengers. They were pirates. Not in poems, not in penny novels. In truth. And truth, as it often does, made people deeply uncomfortable. You could hang a man for piracy with a sermon and a shrug. You could call him a rogue, a devil, a villain. But what did you call a woman who held a blade and smiled when she swung it? Who shouted commands and was obeyed? Or demon? The language of the law buckled under the weight of her existence. Court records from the 1600s and 1700s stutter and stumble when they reach her name. Some scribes strike it out. Some add notes in the margins, questioning her sex, her sanity, her soul. One judge reportedly asked, "But where is her husband?" as if the crime was not piracy, but independence. Because to them, a woman could not want this. Not really. Not willingly. She must have been coerced, bewitched, or broken. Something must be wrong with her, or with the world. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. She just wanted more. More than what the shore offered. More than a quiet life behind curtains. More than a name passed from father to husband like a parcel wrapped in lace. She wanted wind, danger, brotherhood, power. And the sea, indifferent and wild, gave it to her. In the taverns of Nassau, Tortuga, and Port Royal, whispers grew. Men swore they'd seen women aboard black-sailed ships, fighting alongside the worst of them. Some called it madness. Others called it thrilling. But few could deny the rumors had weight. The authorities panicked. Preachers warned of moral collapse. Writers spun tales of sirens and seductresses, trying to fit these women into old myths so they wouldn't have to face a new truth, that women could be pirates, terrible, fearless, brilliant pirates, and no one had seen it coming. They tried to rewrite it, erase it, hide it. But history has a peculiar habit of washing ashore when you least expect it. And in the flotsam of forgotten files and faded letters, we find them. Chingshi, Charlotte, Rachel, Sayyida El-Hura, Fanny, Jebba. Not legends, not fantasies, just women who saw a rope meant for men and climbed it anyway. And Bonnie, fire in her blood. She was born in Ireland sometime around 1700, but her name would echo far beyond the muddy roads of Cork. And Bonnie was not born a pirate. She was born a problem. The daughter of a wealthy attorney and his maid, and was a scandal before she could walk. Her father, William Cormac, tried to hush the affair, to hide the child in the folds of society's politeness. But Anne was not the type to be hidden. Even as a toddler, she had fire in her. The townsfolk whispered about her temper. About the time she stabbed a servant with a butter knife. About the way she stared down grown men with the eyes of someone twice her age. When her mother died and did not cry. When her father was disgraced and fled to the Carolinas and followed, stepping onto a new continent with the same defiant glare. She didn't wear lace. She wore leather. She didn't sew. She smoked. She didn't marry for duty. She married for rebellion. At 16, she wed a poor sailor named James Bonney, much to her father's horror. James was no match for her, and not in wit, not in ambition, not in rage. Her father disowned her, cut her off from inheritance. James took her to Nassau, a lawless pirate haven where every tavern held a secret and every dock whispered opportunity. It was there, among the rum and rust, that and shed the last of her civilized skin. She found her people, or rather, she found her calling, and did not stumble into piracy. She sprinted toward it. She frequented the dens of outlaws, drinking and gambling with men who had blood on their boots. She learned their stories, their tricks, their wounds. She didn't just flirt with danger, she invited it home, asked it to dance, dared it to strike. It was in one of these taverns that she met Calico Jack Rackham, a flamboyant pirate with a love for bright clothes and brighter chaos. Jack wasn't like the other men. He didn't shy from Anne's heat. He leaned into it. And she, finally, found someone who didn't try to tame her. Their affair was explosive, public, scandalous. When word got out, Anne's husband tried to drag her back into obedience through the courts, but Anne laughed in the face of justice. She left James, joined Jack, and never looked back. Together, they stole a ship, raised the black flag, and took to the open sea. But Anne was not just a pirate's mistress. She was a pirate. She dressed as a man, fought like a devil, and swore like a sailor who'd seen hell. Her disguise was thin, often dropped, and quickly forgotten, because no one cared what she wore once they saw her swing a blade. She boarded merchant vessels with a pistol in each hand, roaring threats and daring anyone to resist. She earned her place not through seduction but through ferocity. The crew feared her as much as they did Jack, sometimes more. Her legend grew, and so did the questions. Who was this red-haired fury who fought harder than men and loved like fire? Who stared down death with a grin and stole kisses between cannon blasts? The sea didn't ask. The sea accepted her. But the world above the waves was not so forgiving. In October of 1720, their luck ran out. While anchored off the coast of Jamaica, and Jack and their crew were ambushed by a pirate hunting vessel. Most of the crew were drunk, asleep, or both. The fight was pitiful. Jack surrendered. The crew was chained. The ship was seized and was caught, shackled, paraded. At trial, the judge recited a sentence he had used a dozen times before. Piracy. Hanging. And didn't flinch. She looked the magistrate in the eye and, in a voice cold as steel, said, "If you'd fought like a man, you wouldn't hang like a dog." But Anne had one more trick up her sleeve, or rather, under her ribs. She was pregnant, and in 18th century law, you couldn't hang a woman carrying a child. It was called pleading the belly. It was legal. It was final. She delayed the rope. What happened to Anne Bonny after the trial remains a mystery. Some say she died in prison. Some say her wealthy father pulled strings and saved her. Others claim she escaped, changed her name, remarried, and lived quietly in South Carolina until her death in old age. No one knows for sure, but there are whispers of a red-haired woman who still carried a dagger in her boot, of a wife who refused to cook, sew, or pray unless she felt like it, of a mother who told her children bedtime stories full of cannon fire and stolen treasure. If she did survive, she did not return to the cage. Not really, because Anne Bonny, whether on a gallows or a rocking chair, was never meant to sit still. Mary Read, steel behind the mask. She entered the world not with a cry, but with a secret. Mary Read's story did not begin in a cradle of nobility or comfort, but in a tangled knot of deceit. Her mother, recently widowed and deeply impoverished, had lost her only legitimate son, and with him any claim to inheritance or support. Desperate, clever, and cornered, the woman took a gamble. She dressed her surviving daughter as a boy and passed Mary off as her dead son. It worked. For years, Mary was no longer Mary. She was Mark, a name borrowed from a ghost. Her body bound in cloth, her hair shorn short, her gait taught to be stiff and square. And in this illusion, she learned how to survive. No dolls, no ribbons, no softness. She climbed trees instead of curtains, learned to spit, curse, fight. If the world wanted a boy, she'd give it a better one than they ever imagined. And the truth? It hardened beneath the lie. The longer she lived as Mark, the more she realized she didn't want to return to Mary, not the old Mary, not the one sewn into the fabric of helplessness. The secret didn't define her. It empowered her. As she grew, so did the lie. At 12, she was sent into service as a footboy. At 16, she joined the army under a false name. She carried a musket and stood in lines with soldiers twice her size. She slept in mud, marched in snow, and charged with steel. In time, she even fell in love with a fellow soldier who had no idea that the brave young man beside him was a woman behind cloth and grit. When they left the army together and opened an inn, the mask was removed. Briefly, Mary Reed married him, lived as a wife, and tried the life of hearth and home. But fate, or boredom, has a way of creeping in. Her husband died young, and Mary was alone once again. But not lost. The uniform went back on. The name Mark returned. And so did the sea. She joined a Dutch merchant ship as a sailor, again disguised. And when that ship was captured by pirates, Mary didn't flinch. She didn't plead or weep. She volunteered. Not because she was threatened, because she wanted in. She knew the rules. She'd lived in men's shadows. She'd seen how they held power, how they took it without apology. Now, she would take it too, beneath the black flag and salt sky. It was aboard Calico Jack's ship that she met Bonnie. Accounts differ on how it happened. Some say they crossed swords first, testing each other in combat before trust was earned. Others say Anne was the only one who knew Mary's secret and guarded it like a treasure. A few suggest Anne fell for Mary, not knowing she was a woman, until Mary, perhaps amused, unbuttoned her shirt and revealed the truth. Whatever version, the bond was forged. Two women dressed as men. Two blades sharper than the ship's prow. Two outlaws who refused to shrink. If Anne was fire, Mary was steel. Where Anne raged, Mary endured. She didn't speak as much, didn't laugh as loudly, but when the time came to fight, Mary was the first over the rail, blade drawn, teeth clenched, eyes blazing. There was a kind of purity to Mary's violence, not cruelty, but clarity. She fought because she had to, because the world would never stop questioning her right to exist. And every duel was an answer. Every swing of the sword declared, "I belong here. I earned this." Her shipmates called her fierce. Some called her possessed. But none dared question her place on that deck. Then came October 1720. The end. The capture was a disaster. Calico Jack's crew was drunk, slurring, stumbling, dead to the world. When the pirate hunter's ship appeared on the horizon, it was already too late. The British vessel opened fire. Splinters flew. Sails tore. Chaos erupted. Only two figures stood and fought back. And Bonnie, Mary Red, side by side, pistols blazing, screaming at the cowards around them to rise and fight, holding the line, alone. But two blades cannot stop an empire. The ship was taken. The crew, what was left of them, hauled to port in chains. In the courtroom, the air was thick with powder, sweat, and disbelief. Two women stood before the magistrate, shackled, eyes steady, charged with piracy and sentenced to hang. The spectators murmured. The judge fumbled. The clerks whispered, "Women? Pirates?" It was a contradiction too great to process. So the women gave them one more contradiction. They both claimed they were pregnant, a plea known in law as pleading the belly. If true, it meant postponement. The unborn child was considered innocent, and the law could not punish one soul through the body of another. It was clever. It was true. And it worked. And it delayed the sentence. For Mary, it bought a little more time. But time, like mercy, runs out. Mary Red died in prison a few months later. Likely from fever. Possibly from childbirth. Some say she was buried in an unmarked grave outside the walls, her real name never carved in stone. No ballad. No monument. Just a silence too heavy for the sea to carry. But silence doesn't erase steel. Anne Mary Red, in her quiet fury, had carved her truth into the planks of history. A woman who lived as a ghost, fought as a legend, and died as herself. The trick of the womb. The courtroom was quiet, unnaturally so. Outside, the tropical air of Jamaica buzzed with insects and murmuring townsfolk. But inside the stone-walled chamber, there was nothing but creaking benches, the soft rustle of parchment, and the sound of two women breathing. And Bonnie and Mary Red stood in chains, their ankles heavy with rusted iron. Their hair was matted with sea salt and sweat. Their clothing, men's trousers, loose shirts, and boots, still reeked of gunpowder and ship tar. They stood straight, eyes fixed forward, unblinking. The judge looked at them like one might study a loaded pistol. Not with pity, but with fear. These were not widows or washerwomen. These were pirates. They had burned ships. They had stolen gold. They had killed men. And worse, they had done it while being women. The trial of Bonnie and Mary Red was not just a legal proceeding. It was a crisis. The colony had dealt with hundreds of male pirates. Hangings were routine. Gallows were built with efficiency. The sermons were ready. The warnings clear: steal from the crown and swing for it. But women? Women with pistols and swords and the audacity to command a crew? There were no printed guidelines for this. No legal precedents. The courtroom echoed with confusion. Were they witches? Were they mad? Were they victims? None of these labels fit. They were, in truth, something far more dangerous: free. So the court did what it knew how to do. It condemned them. Death by hanging. To be carried out as soon as convenient. The scribe dipped his quill. The clerk read the sentence. The guards moved forward. And then Bonnie stepped forward, not to beg, not to cry, but to deliver a line so strange, so legal, and so completely subversive that the entire courtroom froze. "I plead my belly." For a moment, silence. Then murmurs. Then confusion. The judge squinted. "What did you say?" "I plead my belly," she repeated, calm and defiant. "I am with child." Beside her, Mary Red echoed, "And I as well." The room erupted. In 18th century British law, a woman sentenced to death could invoke an ancient legal protection, the plea of the belly. If she were pregnant, the execution had to be postponed until the child was born, if not longer. The rationale was simple and chilling. The unborn were considered innocent. You could not kill one soul through another. It was not about mercy. It was about legal optics. public decency, and superstition. If a woman claimed pregnancy, the court was obligated to verify it. And so, beneath vaulted ceilings and chandeliers flickering with candle smoke, the two most notorious women of the Caribbean were examined by a jury of matrons, elderly midwives called in to confirm the claim. No privacy, no dignity, just cold hands and quiet calculations. The verdict? Both women were indeed pregnant. The hangings were delayed. But the story doesn't end there, because the plea of the belly, while rooted in law, became something far more dangerous in the hands of women who understood its power. It became a tool, a tactic, a weapon. For some, it was true. For others, it was convenient. Pirate lore is filled with rumors of women who faked pregnancies to buy time. They stuffed cloth beneath their shirts, swallowed fruit to bloat their bellies, prayed the matrons were old, half-blind, or too embarrassed to argue. Some bribed the guards. Others bribed the midwives. A few simply crossed their fingers and hoped for mercy that never came. But the plea once invoked could mean months, sometimes years, of delay. Delay meant options. Time to plan. Time to escape. Time for a pardon to arrive from across the ocean. Time for bribery to work its quiet magic. Time for public interest to fade. In the dark corners of prison cells, women whispered strategies to each other. Say you feel movement. Cry when they touch you. Breathe heavy, like something's wrong. Don't flinch. The gallows, they had learned, were final. But bureaucracy? Bureaucracy could be bent. For Anne and Mary, the plea was not just legal. It was existential. For Mary, it may have been real. The prison records suggest she died months later, possibly from complications during childbirth. Her body was never claimed. Her child, if it lived, was never recorded. But for Anne, the tale takes a stranger turn. Some say her father intervened, that after months in chains, his shame turned to guilt, and his gold changed the guards' memories. Others believe she escaped, smuggled out in the night under a false name, her belly full of lies and survival. A few swear she returned to the Carolinas, remarried, raised children, and lived to old age, her pistol buried beneath floorboards, her past locked in silence. But what's clear is this. The womb, in a world ruled by men, became an unexpected shield. It was not designed to protect the woman. It was meant to protect the unborn. But in the hands of pirates, it became a loophole, a moment of delay, a crack in the wall, a defiant laugh in the face of executioners sharpening their ropes. And perhaps, in those rare moments of triumph, it became something more. A rebellion. Not of violence, not of blood, but of biology. Because if the world insisted that a woman was only valuable for her womb, then fine. Let the womb be her weapon. The Empress of the South China Sea, Qingxi. History likes its pirates loud, shouting across the deck, raising mugs of rum, swinging from ropes with daggers clenched between grinning teeth. But not all pirates ruled with noise. Some ruled with silence, with contracts, with impossible logic, and with a gaze that could unnerve even the most battle-hardened admiral. Qingxi was one of them. She didn't begin as a pirate. She began as a prostitute in the floating brothels of Canton, those silent, swaying red lanterns anchored in the river, where merchants and navy officers whispered secrets into silk. Her real name was lost, erased in the folds of shame and survival. But the girl beneath the rouge and ribbons listened. She heard how officials lied, how smugglers moved goods, how navy captains were bribed and where tribute money vanished. She memorized faces, patterns, weaknesses. And when the Red Flag Fleet came to port, she knew what to do. Its commander, Cheng Ai, was one of the most powerful pirates on the South China Sea. He didn't just command men, he commanded fear. He was ruthless, sharp, and surrounded by traitors. He visited the brothel, met her, and something in her stare stopped him. She didn't smile. She made demands. If he wanted her, he'd have to give her something no man had ever offered: power. They married in 1801. And She became more than a wife. She became an equal. She read every contract, learned every trade route, sat beside Cheng Ai during negotiations and whispered into his ear like a general. But the real twist came when Cheng Ai died in a storm 6 years later. In most stories, that would be the end of her tale, a widow in mourning, cast aside by ambitious men. But She had no interest in mourning. She wanted his fleet. The Red Flag Fleet was not small. It was the largest pirate confederation in history, over 300 ships, tens of thousands of crew, 6 subfleets, each with its own commander. It ran its own taxes, had its own laws, and had embarrassed the Qing Navy more than once. She knew they would not obey her willingly. Not as a woman, not as a widow. So she made her move with precision. She allied with her late husband's adopted son and protege, Cheng Petsai, who was both her stepson and eventually her lover. Together, they consolidated power. She summoned every ship captain and made them kneel, not in worship, but in contract. She wrote a code, and every pirate signed it. The pirate code of She was brutal and brilliant. All loot was to be recorded and distributed evenly. Theft from the fleet was punishable by death. Disobedience to orders? Assaulting civilians? Death by decapitation. Deserters would have their ears chopped off and paraded before the fleet. She wasn't building a crew. She was building a nation. And it worked. Her ships spread like wildfire across the South China Sea. They controlled trade routes, extorted taxes from villages and even provincial governments. Entire towns paid tribute just to be spared. Fishermen flew her flag so they wouldn't be mistaken for prey. Merchants altered their courses to avoid her waters. When the Portuguese Navy tried to ambush her, they failed. When the British tried, they failed. When the Chinese emperor sent his navy multiple times, they failed. She always came back stronger. But the sea does not stay loyal, and empires don't like being humiliated. By 1810, the pressure was mounting. Her fleet was growing, but so were the enemies. Food was harder to find. Supplies were limited. Some of her subcommanders were getting ambitious, twitching toward rebellion. She could have fought. She could have gone down in a blaze of glory. But she didn't believe in legends. She believed in outcomes. So she made the boldest move of all. She walked into the lion's den. With her lover Cheng Petsai at her side, she sailed into the harbor of Canton. No disguise. No cannon fire, just a small escort ship and a scroll of demands. She marched into the Governor-General's office, silk robes flowing like armor, and calmly offered her terms. She would surrender, but only if she and her crew were granted full amnesty. They could keep their loot. They could retain official ranks within the imperial military. Cheng Petsai would be made a naval officer. She would not be imprisoned. The governor stared at her as if she'd asked to annex Beijing. But she had the leverage. Tens of thousands of trained fighters. Ships still ready for war. And the government knew it could not beat her. So they agreed. Not only was she pardoned, she retired wealthy, honored, and untouched. She lived the rest of her days in Canton, opened a gambling house, raised children, smiled at the men who once called her a monster. She died in 1844. Comfortable, free. In a world where pirates ended on ropes, she ended in silk. She is perhaps the only pirate in history to retire successfully, without betrayal, without prison, without exile. No mutiny, no bullet, no gallows, just silence, and a closed ledger. Parole by proposal. When the courts didn't know what to do with a woman, they did what societies have always done. They married her off. It may sound quaint, romantic even. The idea that a dangerous woman might be reformed by the soft chains of matrimony. That a blade could be traded for a bonnet. That a woman who once commanded fire and steel could be tamed with a ring. But in truth, it was a sentence. Just not one written in rope. It was parole by proposal. A quiet way of saying, you will no longer belong to yourself. You will now belong to him. After the trials, after the pleading of bellies and the delays of childbirth, many female pirates, especially those who had become famous, faced a peculiar fate. They were not left to rot in prison, nor were they always hanged. Instead, they were given a choice: find a man or face the gallows. Some did it to survive. Some, perhaps, found genuine companionship. But for many, it was simply a way to disappear beneath the apron strings of respectability. A woman alone was a threat, but a woman with a husband was contained. The authorities were not subtle about it. In one case, a former female pirate was married off to a former male pirate, another prisoner who had agreed to reform. Their marriage certificate was signed by a magistrate, witnessed by guards, and recorded as a state-sanctioned success story. A pirate love story, wrapped in ribbons, filed away in a drawer. Never mind that the woman had once led raiding parties. Never mind that she'd slit a throat faster than she'd sew a hem. Now she was his problem. And the men? Some were sailors looking to settle. Others were bribed. A few saw it as a badge of honor, to marry the infamous pirate queen, to tame the untamable. They believed they were marrying danger, but often they were marrying ghosts. The woman standing beside them was no longer the same. Prison changed her. Pregnancy changed her. And the sea, once so near, was now only a rumor in her blood. In one documented case, a magistrate described the marriage of a former pirate as a suitable arrangement to ensure the subject's permanent return to moral society. But what he didn't mention was this. The bride didn't smile. She didn't wear white. She wore gray, and her hands were trembling not with joy, but with restraint. There were exceptions, of course. Some women disappeared entirely. No records, no grave, no husband. Just rumors of escape, or quiet deaths far from the sea. Others faked their marriages. Paper unions. Legal ghosts. But most were folded back into society with forced delicacy, like a knife hidden in a silk napkin. They were sent to church, taught to pray, encouraged to give birth and forget the cannon smoke that still lingered in their dreams. And society, relieved, pretended that the pirate had never existed. Only the wife, only the mother, only the lady. But did it work? Not always. There are tales, unverified, unrecorded, whispered on salt wind, of these reformed pirate wives slipping out at night, visiting the docks, speaking in low voices to sailors, gazing at the sea like a lover long denied. One widow was caught smuggling maps. Another was found teaching her son how to load a pistol. A third disappeared entirely after her husband was found poisoned beside an empty rum bottle. No charges were filed, but the local constable quietly requested to be reassigned. And then there were the dreams. You don't scrub away a life of freedom with soap and lace. Some women woke screaming, fists clenched, as if holding ropes. Others slept peacefully but always with one foot dangling, as if still swaying on deck. The sea has a way of staying inside you, even after the salt is gone, even after the child is born, even after the apron is tied and the pew is sat upon. You never really leave. You just get quieter. So when we read the records that say, "She married and lived peacefully," what we should read is this: she survived. Because marriage was not always a happy ending. Sometimes it was just the only ending that didn't come with a noose. And in a world that feared women with swords more than it feared murder itself, what better way to erase them than through vows? Not hanged, not free, just gone. Reform or rebrand. It was said that the best way to tame a storm was to ignore it. And so, when the hangman hesitated and the marriage certificate was signed, the next step in taming a female pirate was simple: reform her. Not with chains, not with sermons, but with fabric, with quiet, with obedience. The state had failed to silence her with death. So now, it would try to smother her with domesticity. They sent her to live with widows and pastors' wives, to learn things like how to thread a needle, how to fold linens, how to curtsy without looking someone in the eye. These were her new weapons: thimbles, teacups, psalms. Gone were the pistols and boarding axes. Gone the midnight raids and secret codes carved into barrels. She was no longer captain. She was a woman in need of healing. Some were enrolled in church charity programs, where elderly matrons sat in circles stitching moral platitudes into handkerchiefs and praying away unladylike impulses. Others were sent to coastal convents, where every bell toll was a reminder of what they were not allowed to be anymore. And yet, the sea never really left them. One nun reportedly asked a newly assigned ex-pirate sister what she had done before joining. The reply? "I once slit a man's throat with less effort than this embroidery." The nun fainted. The pirate smiled. The stitching continued. The goal wasn't education. It was erasure. To smooth out the roughness. To rewrite the story. To turn a threat into a tale of redemption. She once was lost, but now she sews. They gave them new clothes, new names, new roles. Not for the pirate's benefit, but for society's peace of mind. Because it's hard to fear a woman who spends her days arranging flowers and quoting proverbs. Even if, just beneath the surface, she still counted footsteps like a sailor on watch. Still tied knots the old way. Still slept lightly with one hand under the pillow, fingers curled like they once held a knife. And oh, how the public loved these stories. The newspapers printed cheerful updates. Reformed pirate now midwife to orphans. Former pirate queen donates to church roof. Infamous and of the high seas spotted in bonnet and apron. They turned wildness into bedtime stories. Not to remember, but to dilute. To make the story safe. They painted her as a confused girl led astray, now saved by the grace of society. They said she was repentant, that she wept, that she thanked the Lord daily for sparing her. But those who looked closely could tell. The eyes never changed, only the costume. Of course, not all reforms worked. One former pirate, assigned to teach children how to read, was dismissed after teaching them how to forge ship manifests and roll dice. Another stabbed a suitor with a dinner fork after he commented on her fascinating criminal past. A third was arrested for quietly organizing a women's sewing circle, that met at night to discuss escape plans and smuggling. They were moved, reassigned, silenced. But the lesson was clear. You can change a dress, but you can't always change the spirit that wears it. Over time, the names faded. The story softened. The Wild and Bonnie became, and the midwife. Mary Read became the girl who died too young. Ching, she became a legend of discipline and business, not violence. Rebranded, repurposed, rewritten by those who needed the world to make sense again. Because a woman who commands men, survives war, and defies death, well, she unsettles things. Best to let her become a fairy tale. Or better yet, a footnote. And yet, the sea remembers. You can still find traces here and there. A journal tucked into an attic trunk. A dagger hidden behind a chapel altar. A name scratched into the underside of a rocking chair. Women who once led fleets reduced to ghost stories whispered over candlelight. Not reformed, not forgotten, just waiting. Because reform was never the goal. Obedience was. And when that failed, rebranding would do. The price of survival. They didn't die. That was the good news. No ropes, no gallows. No final words carved into newspaper pulp. No wide-eyed crowd gasping as the trapdoor dropped. They lived. But survival in their world came with terms. And not all of them were written down. The woman who once stood at the helm of a burning ship now stood at the back of a chapel, folding him books with shaking hands. The woman who once climbed rigging with knives in her boots now walked slowly through markets, head bowed, as merchants whispered her name like a curse too old to matter. Survival was not freedom. It was a contract, one inked in shame, signed with silence. To stay alive, they had to stop being who they were. And that was the real sentence. No one warns you about the echoes. They don't tell you that the mind will recreate the sound of cannon fire in the silence of laundry day. That your fingers will itch when folding linens because they remember the feeling of rope, salt, iron. That your body, in moments of stillness, will shift its weight like the deck is swaying, even when the floor is dry and still and safe. They don't tell you that safety can feel like a coffin. Some tried to embrace it, tried to pray, tried to pour themselves into the duties of wives, mothers, teachers. They told themselves the sea had been a phase, a fever. They lit candles, took tea, breathed quietly, but in the dark, their dreams betrayed them. Not always nightmares, sometimes just memories. A name called over waves, the smell of powder, the wet snap of sailcloth in storm wind, the rush, the terrible, wonderful rush of watching a ship surrender beneath your flag. Waking up from that kind of dream is not peaceful. It is painful, because you realize it's gone. You realize you're alive, but not really you anymore. Some paid with isolation. Even among others, they were alone, because they could never tell the truth, could never laugh too loudly, or shout, or walk with that confident sailor's stride. Someone might remember, someone might recognize. So they softened themselves, smoothed the edges, lowered their voice, folded their hands just so. But inside, they were still built of smoke and steel. And the dissonance? It tore them apart. Some turned bitter, not because they were cruel, but because bitterness was easier to carry than sorrow. They snapped at neighbors, broke dishes, refused to marry. One was arrested for striking a man who called her darling. Another threw a Bible into a fire and muttered the Lord had never visited the lower decks. The constables wrote reports. Disturbed, unstable, unfit for society. They were reassigned, relocated, silenced. And then there were the quiet ones. The ones who smiled, who planted gardens, who answered to their new names and wrote thank you letters to governors. They looked like success stories, but inside they were hollow, because they had paid the full price of survival. They had erased themselves so well, even they forgot who they once were. The cost was never gold. It was not taken in lashes or in scars. It was taken in memory, in dignity, in the right to tell your story in your own words. Imagine knowing you had once commanded a fleet, and now you had to ask permission to leave the house. Imagine knowing you had once fought 3 men with a dagger, and now you flinched when someone raised their voice. Imagine being remembered not as legend, but as caution. She was lucky she lived. That's what they'd say. But what kind of life was this? And still, they endured. Not because they were weak, but because they were survivors. Survival is not always noble. It's not always graceful. Sometimes it's ugly, quite exhausting, but it is still resistance, even in the smallest breath. A woman wakes before dawn and sharpens a sewing needle just a little longer than necessary. A widow buys salt, not for cooking, but to sprinkle on the windowsill the way she used to on deck. A mother hums a sea shanty to her baby and doesn't know where she learned it. These are the prices, paid not once, but again and again in silence. No statue honors them. No book records their anniversaries. But they lived, and that, in a world that wanted them erased, was an act of defiance all its own. Because some survive by forgetting, but others survive by remembering quietly, beneath their breath, beneath their bonnet, beneath history's blindfold. A lady on the scaffold. It begins with footsteps, always footsteps, measured, deliberate, heavier than the chains that bind her wrists. The gallows creak in the morning fog, black against a colorless sky. The crowd gathers, some out of duty, others out of hunger for spectacle. Children perch on crates. Merchants set down their wares. A priest coughs and flips open his worn Bible. But all eyes, eventually, find her. The woman, the pirate, the anomaly. She does not cry. She does not stumble. She does not shrink beneath their gaze. She climbs the scaffold like she once climbed rigging, barefoot, sure-footed, proud. The records describe them as solemn, or repentant, or raving, but none of the records can ever quite explain the stillness that surrounds a woman who knows she's about to die and refuses to play the part. Some gave speeches, measured like blade strikes, and Bonnie, when faced with her sentence, allegedly looked her captors in the eye and said, "If you'd fought like men, you wouldn't hang like dogs." Another, unnamed, stood silently for 5 full minutes before turning to the priest and whispering, "You're the only one here more afraid than I am." Yet another laughed, tossed her hair back, and winked at the hangman. The rope stopped trembling. The press loved it. They printed their last words in oversized font, embellished their posture, their silence, their snarls. "Hell hath no fury, woman pirate dies defiant. Witch or warrior, lady corsair refuses last rites. Gentleman spectator faints during execution of female pirate." And yet, the words could never quite contain the moment. Because what really disturbed the crowd wasn't the hanging. It was the dignity. They had come expecting a monster. What they saw was a woman who refused to be small. And the hangman? Some hesitated. Some clenched their jaw. One cried. There were no manuals for this. You could hang a thief, a smuggler, a man with blood on his boots. But to hang a woman who had commanded, who had made decisions that changed the course of ships, of crews, of storms. That was something else. Some argued, she's no different than the others. But in their hands, the rope felt heavier, not because of the weight of her body, but the weight of what she represented. A pirate woman on the scaffold was not just a criminal. She was a crack in the world's certainty, a reminder that the rules had not been written in stone, but in fear. She shattered the script, and now the story had to end, publicly, brutally, definitively, to restore order, to erase the idea, to warn the next girl who wondered if she too could sail. But the execution was never clean. The trapdoor might work, the neck might snap, the crowd might cheer or fall into stunned silence. But no one left unchanged. One journal from Port Royal noted that after a female pirate was hanged, the women in the crowd did not cry. They stood still, as if something silent had passed between them all. Something unspoken. A question. A warning. A vow. In rare cases, their bodies were denied burial. Instead, hung in iron cages from docks or city gates, left for the wind and gulls. A warning made visible. But even then, sailors would toss flowers into the water below. Wives would avert their eyes, but not in shame, in defiance. And children, especially little girls, would whisper their names, not in fear, but in awe. Not all were hanged, of course. Some escaped. Some bribed. Some pled their belly, or faded quietly into exile. But those who didn't, the ones who stood tall on the scaffold, were the ones history could not erase. They became myth, not because they wanted to, but because society needed a way to explain what had happened. Because the truth was too uncomfortable to speak plainly. That a woman had looked at the world, had said, no, and meant it. Years passed. The ropes decayed. The names blurred. The papers yellowed. But somewhere, in the salt-soaked corner of some forgotten port, there remains a memory. A pair of boots on old wood. A red scarf fluttering in the breeze. A silence deeper than any sermon. A woman, alone, undefeated, because a woman on the scaffold wasn't just dying. She was declaring, you may take my life, but not my story. Ghosts in the records. History likes neat endings. A death date, a final quote, a clean paragraph closed with a period. But the truth is, most stories do not end. They fade. The records are full of smudges. Names misspelled. Dates uncertain. Details omitted. One woman is listed only as a female found among the crew. Another appears as a footnote in a trial transcript, referred to as wench in trousers, removed before proceedings. Dozens more? Not even that. They vanish from the paper trail like mist burned off by morning light. But mist doesn't vanish. It lingers in the air. And so do they. You see it in ship logs with sudden gaps. A list of captured pirates includes unidentified prisoner, transferred. Transferred where? No record. You find it in local ledgers where extra bread was purchased for a guest who never appears again. In letters between magistrates, she is proving inconvenient. Recommend she be moved quietly. Quietly. Always quietly. Not silenced with rope, but buried beneath administration. The truth is, history erased them on purpose. Because they didn't fit. Because their stories raised questions too dangerous to answer. Why would a woman leave her home? Why would she fight beside criminals? Why would she risk everything for a life on the sea? But the deeper fear was this. What if she was right to do so? What if her choice made sense? What if she wasn't mad, or wicked, or cursed, but just tired of being told to sit down and smile. That kind of truth? It shakes things. So history did what it always does when it feels threatened. It locked the door, threw away the key, burned the diary, renamed the street. Some traces remain. A faded signature in a port register. A dagger found in a woman's coffin, dated far after her supposed death. A lullaby still sung in fishing towns about a lady captain who steals the wind. Children hear it. Elders remember. But no one writes it down. And then there are the whispers at sea. Sailors say that on quiet nights, just before storms, they see shadows on the waves. Not of ships, but of figures. Some silent, moving against the wind. Some say they're ghosts. Others say they're memories made visible. Some even say they're still out there, never caught, never tamed, just waiting. One thing is certain. The official histories, neatly bound in libraries, blessed by scholars, tell only part of the story. They tell you who was tried, who was pardoned, who was hanged, but they don't tell you who escaped. They don't tell you who changed her name, hid her past, taught her daughter how to read tide charts instead of prayer books. They don't tell you about the woman who moved inland, opened a tavern, and secretly bought ships under different names. They don't tell you about the house by the cliffs where women still meet in secret, telling stories not found in any book. Because those stories weren't lost. They were buried, deliberately, lovingly, out of reach, but not gone, never gone. History favors the loud, the victorious, the men who wrote the laws and then broke them with impunity. But in the quiet spaces, between the official pages, live the women who refuse to vanish. Their names may be gone, but their shadows are not. They walk beside us, in every rule we question, in every no that feels like freedom, in every map that shows a coastline where none should be. Ghosts? Perhaps, but not of regret. Ghosts of possibility. Because the greatest rebellion is not to die loudly. It is to live on, silently, stubbornly, invisibly, and to never be truly erased. El, rum, and the gods. Long before ships had sails, before pirates had pistols, and long before the rope ever met a woman's throat, there was drink. And not just to quench thirst. Drink was ritual. Drink was offering. Drink was survival. Drink was divine. In ancient Sumer, over 4,000 years ago, the morning did not begin with tea. It began with beer. Thick, cloudy, served in clay cups so coarse you could feel the grit of grain on your tongue. They called it cass, a liquid meal made from fermented barley and bread. Not quite food, not quite drink, somewhere in between. Workers were paid with it. Children were fed it. Gods were offered it. And make no mistake, it was holy. Temples brewed it. Priests drank it. And a goddess named Ninkasi was said to have taught humanity how to make it. In Egypt, beer was the blood of Hathor, the goddess of joy, music, fertility, and tipsy dancing. But it was her sister, Sekhmet, who drank to forget. According to myth, when Sekhmet was sent to punish humanity, she enjoyed it too much. She slaughtered with glee, unstoppable. The gods panicked. To stop her, they brewed red beer and poured it across the desert. Sekhmet drank it, thinking it was blood. She became drunk, then sleepy, then soft. The world was spared, and so beer saved civilization. More than once. But beer was not enough for everyone. In the rocky hills of Greece, wine reigned. Not just as a beverage, but as a philosophy. The Greeks mixed their wine, always. 3 parts water to 1 part wine, unless you were feeling dramatic. To drink it undiluted was seen as barbaric, uncivilized. a sign of madness or worse, poor breeding. They drank not to forget, but to think differently. In the symposia, the sacred wine parties, men gathered to debate, laugh, weep, and flirt. Philosophers poured ideas as often as they poured wine. Socrates, Plato, even the tyrants. And presiding over it all was Dionysus, god of wine and theater and ecstatic breakdowns. His followers, the Maenads, would disappear into the forest, drink until reality bent sideways, and return with twigs in their hair and fire in their eyes. To be drunk, in Dionysus' name, was not disgrace. It was divine contact, a holy collapse. And then came the Romans, who drank everything the Greeks did, but in larger quantities and with more organization. Wine in Rome was classified like fine currency. There were vintages, regions, preferences. The elite drank honeyed wine from silver goblets. The poor drank pasca, sour wine mixed with herbs and vinegar. Soldiers were issued daily rations. Slaves were sometimes paid with it. And just like in the sea battles to come, wine was used to blur pain, ignite courage, and pass time that might never return. Farther east, in ancient China, alcohol was not just drink. It was cosmic alignment. Rice wine was used in sacrifices. Fermented fruit drinks in marriages. Elixirs of immortality brewed for emperors who feared death more than anything. The Chinese understood alcohol not only as celebration, but as ritual calibration between heaven and earth. To toast was to connect spirits, of people, of ancestors, of nature. Some emperors were buried with jugs of wine, so they might continue to commune with their lineage in the next life. In India, there was soma, mystical, forbidden, but mentioned over 100 times in the Rig Veda. No one knows for certain what it was. A mushroom? A fermented plant? A hallucinogenic cocktail? Whatever it was said to flow like golden lightning, to make men feel immortal, and to bring gods down to earth. To drink soma was to open your soul like a temple door, and let light scream in. Across oceans, in jungles and deserts, humans kept fermenting. Chicha in the Andes, spit brewed by women and shared communally. Palm wine in West Africa. Mead in Norse longhouses, where warriors toasted the gods and boasted their own names into legend. In long winters in war-torn villages, in moments between birth and burial, alcohol became language. A language of risk, of celebration, of forgetting what must be forgotten. And in every era, in every empire, drink walked hand in hand with the divine. Sometimes a gift, sometimes a curse, always a mirror, because what you drink says less about your thirst, and more about what you're running from. Pets of the ancients. Before kingdoms had crowns, before temples had gold, before names were carved into stone, there was a dog curled at someone's feet, a cat watching stars from a windowsill, a bird whispering secrets from a wooden perch. We think of pets as modern luxuries, soft, sweet things for quiet lives. But in truth, they are ancient companions, and they have always mattered more than we remember. In Egypt, pets were not just animals. They were family. They were status. They were sacred. The dog was the image of Anubis, the jackal-headed guide to the afterlife. When someone died, a dog might be buried with them to lead them safely through the dark. But dogs weren't just for death. They were guards, hunters, friends. Archaeological digs at workers' villages near the pyramids reveal collars, bones, toys. A painted inscription reads, "My dog followed me as faithfully as my shadow." Even pharaohs wept when their dogs died. Cats? They were royalty. To own one was to court grace, To harm one? Blasphemy. A Roman soldier stationed in Alexandria once killed a cat, accidentally. The locals rioted. He was torn apart by the mob. Not even the pharaoh intervened. Cats were protectors of grain, of children, of souls. They were mummified, wrapped with care, placed beside their humans in tombs. Sometimes more ornate than the people themselves. A purring deity, a priest in fur. In Mesopotamia, birds were used to deliver omens. But some were kept simply for their song. A lullaby carved in cuneiform speaks of a child falling asleep as a bird hums in a reed cage. Let the winged thing guard your dreams. Parrots came later with empire. To own one in Rome was a status symbol, not because they were useful, but because they could speak. A bird that echoed Latin poetry was more impressive than a senator who only repeated laws. And then there were the peculiar ones. In Persia, peacocks strutted in palace gardens. Not for beauty, but as watchers, thought to see both this world and the next. In Greece, tortoises lived in courtyards, believed to bring patience and luck. Some philosophers even carried them in sacks to study their motion and perhaps their wisdom. In Celtic lands, warriors painted wolves on their chests, but raised foxes in their homes. In pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, the Zolite squintly, the Mexican hairless dog, was more than a pet. It was a guide to the underworld, believed to carry the dead across rivers of darkness. To kill one was to lose your path in the afterlife. To love one? A sacred bond. Even the Vikings, rough and frost-bitten, had lapdogs. Buried with them. Sung about in sagas. A dog named Freki was said to sit at Odin's side. One chieftain was entombed with his hound curled around his boots, its paws still guarding centuries later. But these animals were not always loved. Some were sacrificed. Others were eaten. In lean winters, a family might choose to starve or say goodbye to the creature that had warmed their children's feet. The bone fragments tell the truth. Love and survival don't always agree. Still, for most, a pet was not a thing. It was a presence, a pair of eyes by the hearth, a heartbeat that wasn't your own, a reminder that the world could be soft, even in the shadow of empire. And when they died, people grieved, openly, deeply, sincerely. Roman tombstones bear heartbreaking inscriptions. I weep for you, little friend. You never barked without cause. Now you are silent and I am cold. Some had funerals. Some were buried in yards with food and toys. One Egyptian woman was found mummified beside a monkey, its hand resting in hers. Not every pet had fur. Some kept fish, not in bowls, but in carved stone basins, watching them flicker like reflections of the soul. Some kept beetles for protection. Some kept snakes for wisdom. Some kept crickets for luck, and to hear the ticking of time in the dark. The farther you look back, the more you realize. People have always needed something small to love. Something that doesn't ask why the war came. Something that listens without reply. Something that waits by the door when no one else does. In a Roman villa, a widow feeds a crow from her window every morning. In a Chinese village, a grandfather lets his old dog sleep on the family altar. In an Aztec temple, a child weeps for her Zolo, buried beneath a clay floor, wrapped in red thread. None of them knew each other. None spoke the same tongue, but they shared a truth so quiet, it hums across time, that the soul of a home may be no larger than two eyes. For pause, and the echo of a name whispered long after the food bowl is empty. Drinking with the dead. In every culture, at every time, beneath every sky, humans have poured drink for the dead. not because the dead could sip, but because the living still remembered. In ancient Egypt, when a noble died, wine was poured on the sand, not for waste, but as invitation, to let the soul know, you are still welcome at the table. Clay amphorae were buried in tombs, sealed with wax and prayers. Their contents? Date wine, honey mead, barley beer, meant to nourish the spirit in its journey beyond the veil. Sometimes the wine was still fragrant when the tomb was opened thousands of years later. A ghost in a bottle, a scent preserved in silence. In the cold hills of Celtic Europe, warriors raised drinking horns over graves. Not for mourning, but for memory. They sang songs. They spilled ale. They laughed too loudly, on purpose, so the dead would not feel left out. To the Celts, the line between life and death was thin as smoke. Drink made it porous, a way to let voices cross over, even briefly. In Greece, they practiced libation, a sacred pouring of wine to the earth, to the gods, and to the underworld. You poured for Dionysus, god of joy, for Hades, lord of silence, for the shades of those you had loved, and maybe still feared. A libation was not a toast. It was an offering, a contract, a whisper to the soil. I remember you. Don't forget me. In ancient China, ancestor worship required drink. Rice wine was poured in tiny cups, placed on altars beside incense and scrolls. Not to get the dead drunk, but to honor their thirst for remembrance. The dead were never truly gone. The Chinese believed, only unfed. So they fed them. With smoke. With prayer. With drink. And if the cup went untouched, they drank it themselves, so the spirit could feel the warmth through their breath. In Rome, funerals were followed by feasts. Graveside banquets. Wakes full of food, tears, and wine. So much wine. It wasn't morbid. It was proper. To weep and eat. To toast the one who'd gone, and then get a little too loud. So you could forget the fact they weren't answering. A Roman poet once wrote, "If I am not remembered in wine, do not bother to bury me." In the far north, Viking funerals set ships on fire. But first, they poured mead into the mouths of the dead. One last drink. To light the way. Sometimes, the mead was poured into the earth. Sometimes into the fire. Sometimes just into the wind, so the dead could taste the sky. Even in medieval Christian Europe, where sin was counted and catalogued, the idea of drink with the dead lingered. Priests would consecrate wine. Family members would sit beside graves. Candles flickered in churches beside cups left for those who no longer had lips. It wasn't about pleasure. It was about presence. To say, you were once alive. You were once loved. In Mesoamerica, during the Day of the Dead, drinks are still left on altars. Tequila, chicha, sometimes just clean water, because the dead walk that night, and walking makes you thirsty. Somewhere, across centuries, someone poured wine beside a tomb. Somewhere, they poured too much and sat beside it in silence. Somewhere, a daughter poured beer on the threshold, just in case her father's ghost still paused there before returning to dust. And always the same gesture, cup in hand, eyes closed, a sip for the living, a pour for the dead, because the body may end, but ritual lives. And if you listen closely, on certain nights, in certain winds, you might hear it. The clink of pottery, the rustle of leaves, the sound of someone gone, still being remembered, the curse of superstition. There are two kinds of fear, one born of swords and the other born of silence. The first breaks the body, the second bends the world. Superstition was not silly in the ancient world. It was not cute or harmless or optional. It was law, unwritten but no less binding, and often far more terrifying. In ancient Egypt, curses were carved into tombs like barbed wire. May the scorpion sting you. May the crocodile drag you. May your name be erased from the book of life. Grave robbers ignored the warnings until they died. Suddenly, mysteriously, one after another. Of course, some say it was just coincidence, or ancient poisons, or trapped air, or paranoia. But to the people of the Nile, the answer was clear. The curse worked. In Babylonia, kings refused to sleep during eclipses. If the sky went black, they placed a fake king on the throne, a royal scapegoat. He dined like a king, ruled for a day, then disappeared. Not because the stars demanded it, but because the priests believed they might. It wasn't the science of the heavens. It was the fear of what the heavens might mean. In Greece, curses came in the form of binding spells, scratched into lead tablets and buried in graves. Some were for love, some for revenge, some just to make a neighbor's crops fail. I bind your tongue. I bind your strength. I bind your name to the dirt. And sometimes it worked. Or at least, someone believed it had, and that was enough to ruin a man. In Rome, people didn't build houses facing west. Not because of light or heat, but because the dead came from the west. It was the direction of endings. To live facing west was to sleep with ghosts. They wore amulets, painted protective eyes, whispered counter curses under their breath in crowded markets. One Roman soldier refused to enter a new fort unless the floor was swept with juniper first, to drive away the old spirits. His comrades laughed, until he was the only one who survived the night raid. Coincidence? Superstition didn't ask. It only warned. In China, numbers had power. 4 sounded like death. 8 sounded like prosperity. Buildings skipped entire floors. Weddings were delayed. Children weren't born until lucky dates aligned. But this wasn't irrational. It was practical, because luck, once disturbed, was hard to unbind. In India, curses flowed from sages and gods like wildfire. One wrong insult to a rishi, and your descendants might suffer for 38 lifetimes. Kingdoms fell from one misspoken word. Heroes turned to monsters because of a mother's grief or a father's broken vow. The Mahabharata is stitched together by curses. Not arrows, not armies, but words. Even in Norse mythology, the runes were feared more than swords. To carve a rune was to shape fate. One Viking poem warns, "The rune of madness, once carved in love, brought fire to my roof, and silence to my hearth." A symbol on a shield might protect, or it might destroy, and once carved, it could not be undone. Superstition was not about what was true. It was about what was possible. That behind every door was a whisper. That every shadow had a shape. That saying the wrong thing might call something that could not be unsaid. Even today, echoes remain. People knock on wood, hold their breath in tunnels, avoid ladders and broken mirrors. Not because they believe, but because, what if? What if the old gods are still listening? What if the grave is not quiet? What if fear itself is sacred? Because once upon a time, to be safe, you didn't need a weapon. You needed a word, a charm, a silence kept too long, the ink that forgot her name. History remembers the bold, the violent, the loud, but only if they are men. Women who raised swords, sailed seas, or rewrote their own destinies were rarely remembered. And if they were, it was not kindly. They were monsters, witches, liars. Their names became warnings. Their stories twisted into cautionary tales. And eventually, their ink ran dry. There were more female pirates than we will ever know. Women who rode the tides, who bled for gold, who cursed the crown and kissed the wind. Women who dressed as men not to deceive, but to survive. Who led mutinies, who buried loot, who stared down gallows and smiled anyway. Some died unknown. Some lived long in disguise. Some became ghosts before they were ever written down. History has rules. It likes heroes to be men. It likes rebellion to be noble, but not too messy. It likes pirates to be romantic, so long as they aren't female. A man who defies a king becomes a legend. A woman who defies a king becomes a problem. And problems get buried. Under dust. Under doubt. Under silence. But silence is not the same as forgetting. Sometimes it just waits. In the sea foam. In the footnotes. In the margins of a law book that never imagined a woman with a pistol. Sometimes all it takes is a question. Why weren't there more of them? And suddenly the fog clears, and the sea remembers. You'll hear it in ballads sung off-key, in old maps with strange islands, in the way some ships are still called she, in the way some stories just won't stay buried. And Bonnie didn't die politely. Mary Read didn't beg. Ching Shi didn't apologize. They lived too loudly for that. They died too complicated for statues. And they left behind a whisper in every woman who ever said, "I don't care what I'm allowed to do. I'll do what I must." And maybe that's why their stories survived at all. Not because the world remembered them, but because they refused to be forgotten. Their names are carved in salt. Their legends tattooed on waves. And even when the ink fades, the sea still carries their stories.